everyone. When I reviewed Rio Bravo earlier this year, I had every intention of rewatching and then reviewing El Dorado shortly thereafter. But as with most things that I intend to review, it took me some time to get around to actually doing that. But I finally did, and I'm sure glad that I watched it again. It had been a while since my last viewing, and going in this time, I had one question I wanted to answer, which I'll get to. Regardless of how good a film El Dorado is, and it is a great one, let me say that right away. But regardless of that, it will always live in the shadow of Rio Bravo. For better or worse, that's how it is. Many people have said that it and Rio Lobo are remakes of Rio Bravo. And when they say that, it's normally meant to put down those later films. And while I can't defend Rio Lobo as vigorously, despite having a marvelous turn by Jack Elam in it, El Dorado is a movie that definitely deserves to stand on its own. The first half is a completely different story from Rio Bravo. The conflict at its core is also different, here being a range war. But it's when we enter the second half that things begin to look a lot more familiar. All the familiar character types can be found, albeit played by other actors, most of them anyway. It's filmed at Old Tucson with plenty of nighttime action scenes, and again revolves around a small but dedicated group of professionals as they square off with the local crime boss. There's a hostage exchange, 2 of them this time, a man shot down in the street, and plenty of other little moments that bring to mind the classic that is Rio Bravo. It's directed by the legendary Howard Hawks, populated by a who's who of Western genre stalwarts, and was written once again by Lee Brackett. So with all that in mind, my question was this: why is El Dorado considered a lesser movie than Rio Bravo? For most people, I mean. I'm sure there are strong defenders of El Dorado that will argue that it exceeds Rio Bravo. Maybe for some people El Dorado is their favorite John Wayne or even their favorite movie in general. I love it too, but I would fall amongst those that say Rio Bravo is a masterpiece. And El Dorado is a great film, but doesn't quite work the way that Rio Bravo does. So why is that? In my attempts to answer that, by no means do I want to tear down El Dorado. Like I said, it's a movie I love. But there are a few things I noticed this time, small and large, that make it work in a different way. Just a note, El Dorado was made 7 years after Rio Bravo, which is the same length of time between Rio Bravo and High Noon, the other movie that gets discussed the most in relation to Rio Bravo. As I said, the cast of El Dorado is wonderful, and leading the gang is none other than John Wayne. Where Rio Bravo displayed the Duke at the peak of his powers, El Dorado shows us an older, slightly more heightened version of that as he moved into the latter part of his career, where he became the aging mountain of a man that could part a gang of outlaws with an angry glance, as he does in Cahill, U.S. Marshal. John Wayne plays Cole Thornton, a hired gunslinger that first nearly finds himself on the wrong side of a range war before joining the other side. John Wayne is wonderful in the movie, and the thought that kept running through my mind as I watched him was, he's a master. Every squint, every pause in his speech, every movement of his hands has been practiced over decades of playing men like this, and I still can't believe how charismatic he is. Tough? Sure. Funny when he needs to be? Definitely. But he just has such a smooth way of conducting himself. Almost everyone else in the movie, even Robert Mitchum, feels like they're acting sometimes. But John Wayne just is, and I love it. El Dorado is a very loose, carefree feeling movie much of the time, but it still finds time for some small but powerful emotional moments. The one example is after Cole Thornton has accidentally caused the death of a young man played by Johnny Crawford. Thornton, angry at what he was forced to do and powerless to have stopped the man from shooting himself, brings the boy's body back to his family. The way in which he explains what happened, and upon having the boy's father thank him for bringing the body back to them, simply says, "It don't help much." It's really moving. You can feel the regret of seeing a life like this cut short. A movie like El Dorado doesn't need a scene like that, but Howard Hawks knew to include it, and John Wayne gives it everything he's got, but also with such subtlety. There's nothing overtly dramatic about it. I've said it before, and I'll say it again, John Wayne was an incredible actor. Robert Mitchum plays J.P. Hera, the drunk character that these movies share. Although here, we see Hera before his fall, then during, and finally, after. Whereas with Dean Martin's Dude, we meet him a couple of years into his miserable existence as Borachon. Mitchum is very good, which he almost always is, and he and John Wayne share great, although somewhat competitive chemistry throughout. At the beginning, they're two wary and friendly potential adversaries, sizing each other up. And then later, Wayne brings out the tough love to try and bring his friend out of his stupor and restore him to greatness. What's notable is that Mitchum's character is heralded as being one of the 4 fastest guns in the West, but we never really see that put to the test. There's a great bit of dialogue where John Wayne first tells the Nelson McLeod character about there being a 4th man with equivalent speed, to which McLeod answers, "Which one are you?" "I'm Thornton," John Wayne says. It's such a smooth way of admitting that he knows that he's as good as everyone says, while admitting his friend is just as deadly. The dialogue by Lee Brackett is wonderful throughout, even if in comparison to Rio Bravo, some of it feels more unnatural and very stylized. There's a couple of key differences between J.P. Hera and Dude. The first is that Dude's descent into alcoholism is always seen as a tragedy, and Dean Martin's performance cements that. With Hera, Robert Mitchum is tasked with playing a character that's become the pitiful laughingstock of the town, while also milking the humor from his situation for us, the audience. And it's a credit to Mitchum that he's able to do that seamlessly. He can be racked with pain one minute, staggering through the street, while only a couple of scenes earlier, he was duking it out with John Wayne in a comedic brawl. I love those scenes, especially the one where he's force-fed the putrid-looking cure that Mississippi conjures up, but it does prevent the character's downfall from reaching the dramatic heights that Dean Martin did with Dude. And I think that's intentional. Howard Hawks knew full well what he was doing. The similarities these movies share were by no means lost on him. So the focus of this character becomes split as a way of differentiating the 2 characters. The other difference can be seen most clearly in the scene where Hera tracks down the attempted murderer of one of the McDonald boys. In Rio Bravo, one of my favorite scenes is Dude uncovering the killer hiding in the rafters. Here, that's changed to a man hiding behind the saloon piano, being revealed by the nervous piano player hitting a few too many wrong notes. While it's not as clever as the droplets of blood dripping from the ceiling, or as memorable, what really sets the 2 scenes apart is the behavior of the men. Dean Martin plays the scene like a downtrodden man beginning to regain what he's lost, shocking himself and the whole room, and we watch his confidence grow throughout. Robert Mitchum goes at it with an unbridled rage that comes from having been laughed out of the saloon earlier that night. Robert Mitchum is kind of scary, and as he beats Jim Davis and then Ed Asner across the face with his rifle barrel, you believe that he could wind up killing them, regardless if their hands were up. It's an interesting and stark contrast between these men. The vulnerability of Dude is much more fleeting in Hera. Dude only really gets angry when he fails later in the film, letting himself down just as much as John T. Chance. J.P. Hera is personally offended and wants the world to see that he's not as far gone as they all think. James Caan plays Mississippi, real name Alan Badillion Traherne, the mispronunciation of which leads to one of the funniest moments in the film. I love that scene. James Caan is so young here and is a ton of fun in the movie. He's basically an early version of Inigo Montoya, tracking down the killers of his old friend, who left him the strange hat that he wears. He's even given similar dialogue about not having a purpose in life after being in the revenge business so long. I am a huge Princess Bride fan, so I look for connections everywhere. He and John Wayne have such a great dynamic on screen. It's incredible. The young men of Rio Bravo and Rio Lobo, Ricky Nelson and Chris Mitchum, respectively, unfortunately don't share quite the same degree of chemistry with the Duke, although I'm fans of both of them. But those early scenes with John Wayne and James Caan, their dialogue is something to behold. The part where Mississippi asks if he fell off his horse, yeah! The part where Thornton fills in "Ride boldly, ride," after having a lengthy portion of the oft-repeated poem recited to him, and their shooting lesson. Their banter is one of the highlights of the film, and it dawned on me when James Caan said, "I always make you mad, don't I?" That their back and forths are the closest equivalent to what Rio Bravo had in Angie Dickinson. I'll get to the leading lady here, but seeing John Wayne frustrated, impatient, and yet wanting to protect a younger person that he meets is the closest thing to those same types of scenes in Rio Bravo, although obviously those have a romantic spin to them. Unfortunately, once they get to El Dorado, James Caan fades into the background more so, but still finds moments to shine, even if most of his time is spent smiling or giving knowing looks on the sidelines, while his older colleagues, one in particular, chew the scenery. And that one in particular is Arthur Hunnicutt. I typically like him, and I do for the most part here as well, but Walter Brennan, he is not. If I had to pick out one character that feels weakest in this film, it would be Arthur Honeycutt's bull. When he speaks, it feels overly mannered at times, and especially when they cut away to the other characters in the middle of his dialogue, it almost feels like they're waiting for his drawl to just stop. He's still a fun character, blowing a bugle all the time, hauling out a bow and arrow when the action needs to go silent, but he doesn't have nearly the chemistry with the other characters that Stumpy has. In Rio Bravo, those four men feel like a team to me, and like they could all be friends, even if they're dysfunctional ones. Here, I can see Thornton, Hera, and Mississippi becoming a well-oiled machine, but Bull always stands out to me. For another brief Rio Bravo reference, I believe Bull is playing the opening notes of My Rifle, My Pony, and Me on his harmonica before being cut off. One thing that dawned on me after watching is that Arthur Hunnicutt played Davy Crockett in The Last Command, the Republic-produced film about the Alamo that John Wayne was set to direct and star in before he and Herbert Yates stopped seeing eye to eye. So I'm curious if there was any long-standing beef between the Duke and Arthur Hunnicutt, considering both played Davy Crockett, even if their films were released 5 years apart. I'm guessing there wasn't, but you never know. Charlene Holt is given the rather small role of Maudie, the equivalent of Angie Dickinson's Feathers, only in that she's one of two women in the movie. I like her well enough, but ultimately her character doesn't amount to very much. At the beginning, it appears a potential love triangle is being set up, with both Thornton and Hera having designs on her, but that fades very quickly, and she becomes Thornton's very casual girlfriend. I suppose her choice of Thornton could have driven Hera into the arms of the woman that broke his heart in between scenes, but otherwise she doesn't affect the story in any meaningful way. Our main villain is played by Ed Asner, replacing John Russell, and is his opposite in nearly every way. Bart Jason is, well, he's Ed Asner, so he's short, balding, and not terribly intimidating, but he has money, and can pay for all manner of dastardly things he needs done. I really like Ed Asner in the role. He's such an unusual choice and stands up to John Wayne very well. But the villain that's the most fun is the scar-faced Nels McLeod, played by Christopher George. He's the stereotypical hired gun with the flat black hat, the two guns, even a shiny vest towards the end, and he's perfect. He and John Wayne are so amicably threatening. And what I love about the character is that he doesn't underestimate Thornton. He knows exactly what he's up against, and so does Thornton. Right up to their final scene, that respect is there between them. There are plenty of Western characters described as cool, collected, quick as a rattlesnake, and that's Nels McLeod in every way. The rest of the cast is also uniformly excellent, from R.G. Armstrong as the strong-willed but good rancher Kevin McDonald, to Michelle Carey as his fiery daughter, to Paul Fix as the town doctor. And finally, I have to mention Don Collier in a brief role as a deputy, and Dean Smith as the low-down killer that James Caan dispatches with his knife. I got to meet Don Collier in Kanab, Utah, a few years ago, and met Dean Smith at the Memphis Film Festival as well. Both were so friendly and seem to have had the time of their lives making westerns like this one. Besides the character types, another similarity to Rio Bravo is the theme of professionalism and being good at something. If that concept is thrown around in Rio Bravo, it's mentioned nearly constantly in El Dorado. The gunmen, the ranchers, even the doctor, they all talk about being good. Whether or not they're good, if their competitors are good, or if someone was once good but isn't anymore. And that is the theme that is honed in on the most in this movie. The importance of that is paramount. No pun intended. And if you're not good, then you're also not useful to our characters. You should stand aside and join the townsfolk that hover in the background. As I said before, the dialogue is great across the board, but the delivery of it can waver. Everyone in the movie speaks like a world-weary pro, and when it's someone like John Wayne or Christopher George, that works. When it's Charlene Holt, it can feel forced. But other than that central theme, almost everything else in the movie is much less focused, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. The story is about a range war, but we experience it all through people caught in the middle of it. The actual skirmishes that make up the war, be that one of the McDonalds being shot or another being kidnapped later on, happen off-screen, and we hear about it when our heroes do. Where Rio Bravo centers largely around four men holed up in a jailhouse, under siege, that idea is mentioned in El Dorado, but they don't actually spend that much time holed up there. It's mentioned that they're under constant threat from McLeod and Bart Jason's other men, but for most of the movie, McLeod hasn't even hit town, and the romance, which is so important in Rio Bravo, is again breezed over. And I think that might be part of what holds El Dorado back from becoming another masterpiece. That lack of focus. Rio Bravo sets up its scenario and all of our characters, and then we live with them. in that place, never leaving town, for 2 hours and 20 minutes. El Dorado moves around a lot, from one ranch to the other, to several different towns, and the threat continues changing, with new threats and new objectives entering the scene until it all comes back to El Dorado for the final showdown. There's another aspect to El Dorado that isn't in Rio Bravo whatsoever, and that is the concept of aging, and having lost a step because of it. By the finale of Rio Bravo, these are 4 almost infallible heroes, blasting sticks of dynamite out of the sky against staggering odds. By the end of El Dorado, you have 2 of our heroes hobbling down the street on crutches, one of them also afflicted by occasional paralysis in his gun hand, and another hero, a somewhat green young man that is still so bad at shooting that he wounded John Wayne during the gun battle. I think this is Howard Hawks looking back and saying, yeah, we're not perfect, but we're still pretty good. It's not delved into very deeply, but in some ways it's the lighthearted version of John Ford's sentiments in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. These heroic, fastest guns of the West aren't necessarily what everyone believes them to be, but they still get the job done. The score was by Nelson Riddle, and the best part of it is the opening song, also called El Dorado, and sung by George Alexander. That song is fantastic, and as the movie begins, I know it's going to be stuck in my head for days afterward, and I don't mind in the least. The opening credits play out over beautiful paintings by Olaf Weghorst, who played the very memorable Swedish gunsmith in the movie. The rest of the score is very much of its time. Where Rio Bravo had the iconic melodies of Dmitri Tiomkin, El Dorado has a very 60s sounding, bouncy score. For one example, go back and rewatch the scene where they're making their way down the street at night. That track could be slotted into an episode of Get Smart, The Munsters, or even a Don Knotts comedy and not sound out of place. I don't mind it, but it doesn't hold up in the same way when put up against the scores of Elmer Bernstein or Tiomkin that typically turned up in John Wayne's films. The costumes were by Edith Head, who I was very surprised to realize did quite a number of westerns in her time. The costumes here are very colorful, which I'm always in favor of, but some of them do feel a little too inauthentic. Michelle Carey's leather pants come to mind. I don't think even Edith Head would attempt to stray too far from John Wayne's established brand, so he dresses pretty much like he always does, naturally including his Red River D belt buckle. James Caan's fringed shirt is pretty nice though, and I'm curious if Kevin Costner's Silverado costume was inspired by it. But one thing I've always wondered is what was up with this vest that Robert Mitchum wears. It looks like it belongs on the Hunchback of Notre Dame or something like that. Regardless, I'm sure Edith Head had the most fun designing Charlene Holt's various costumes though. It seems Howard Hawks was wanting to experiment with more special effects for this go-round, and it always stands out to me that James Caan was filmed in front of a different background with an animated muzzle flash added to his sawed-off shotgun blast every time he shoots. Also, that crazy scene where James Caan, again, dives under a bunch of horses to begin shooting at the riders with the horse footage playing on a large screen, it seems. It's also a slightly more violent movie than Rio Bravo, with that sadistic scene of John Wayne shooting a man several times to force him out of a doorway. I've got a few more assorted notes. El Dorado can be added to the short list of films in which John Wayne actually twirls his loop-levered Winchester, alongside movies like Stagecoach and True Grit. For a couple other brief Rio Bravo references, John Wayne kicks a bottle away from Mitchum in the same way he kicked away the spittoon in the opening scene. And the way he calls out McDonald, Kevin McDonald, sounds suspiciously like Burdette, Nathan Burdette. And that scene where he backs his horse away from Bart Jason's gang is pretty impressive. John Wayne does a lot of his own riding in this movie, and that scene will always be a standout. And finally, 2 scenes from El Dorado were used to illustrate the history of John Bernard books in the opening of The Shootist. Taken out of context, they're just moments of John Wayne shooting bad guys in all his glory. But when you look at the scenes that were chosen, it's him shooting a young man on accident, an action he regrets for the rest of this movie, and the other is him blasting away with his left hand, his right hand immobile, preparing to go down in a blaze of glory. I'd like to think they were chosen to demonstrate the complicated past of J.B. Books, a man that lives with regrets, and who stared death in the face before and only narrowly escaped. I love The Shootist. It's the most perfect final film any actor has ever had. But back to El Dorado. Did I answer why it hasn't cracked my absolute favorite list of John Wayne films? For me, I think so. But in the end, it really doesn't matter. Westerns like these are the reason I fell in love with this genre in the first place. They truly do not make them like this anymore. In case it's not obvious, I highly recommend it. Thanks so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this, I hope you'll check back to Hildebrand Productions for more. Thanks again, and adios for now.